Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? If you're a new bass guitar player, this video is going to contain a lot of useful information to help you demystify the world of bass guitar amplifiers. And if you're a seasoned bass player, I believe it's still going to provide a lot of value for you because very often it's been my experience over the decades that these questions get asked over and over again by people that have been around for a long time. I know this for a fact because for a long time I co-moderated the Amps forum on talkbass.com, which is a great website. My moniker over there is Ivan Mike. Later on I tacked on the 1968 to everything else. And that's where I started using a Mandy avatar, which has nothing to do with this video. So anyhow, a bass guitar amplifier, any amplifier, but bass guitar amplifiers in particular, their entire job is to take the low-level signal coming out of the pickups of your bass and turn it into sound. And, these are electric instruments. And, man, if the power grid goes out, I'm going to be lost because they don't make a lot of noise when they're not plugged in. And even the acoustic versions really don't have the oomph that something like an upright bass has. Now, there are a lot of parts and stages inside a bass guitar amplifier to consider. So we're going to talk about those a little bit because it's helpful to know what the heck is going on, because you have a lot of options in terms of what you're going to get. And right now I'm going to drink some delicious Diet Coke. All right, first thing you can do is have a combo. You have a combo if all you need is an instrument cable and your bass, and you turn it on and it makes noise. That's a combo. You could have an amp head and cabinets. We call these amp heads integrated heads very often. This is an amp head, no cabinet attached, and I've got cabinets back there. And all you need is an instrument cable and some kind of speaker cable, depending, and we'll get to that eventually. And boom, it makes sound. Or you could have a fully modular setup where you've got a preamp and a power amp and speaker cabinets, and it could be powered speaker cabinets, where in that case you just have a preamp and powered speaker cabinets. So there's various different methods. And essentially what's happening in all these cases is you're taking the combo amp apart and putting it into different parts. So the upsides of combos is they're really portable. It's all in one. You just need a cord. You plug it in. It makes noise. The downsides to combos is they can be limited. It's pretty much what you see is what you get. They might not be loud enough for your particular application. They generally are not that expandable except for maybe sometimes an extension speaker, although we'll get to that as well in terms of what kind of extension speaker you can or cannot use. The downside used to be weight. Before, nowadays, the amps that they make now with the neodymium speakers and the Class D power amps, they tend to be really, really light. I had a friend had one, I picked it up, and I think it was a Fender Rumble. I'm like, you're kidding me, really? That's great amp. Back in the day, and the used market is still huge, so you might go buy a used amplifier, which are great deals. But, I don't know if you remember the PVTNTs and the SWR Redheads and all these things, and you pick it up and you're like, okay, well, who's the guy you're going to sell me that's going to carry this thing for me? Because, holy crap, they weren't light. So that's the downside, upsides and downsides of combos. The upsides of like having a head and cabinets is it's upgradable. You can swap out heads and decide I like this other head that has more power or has a different tone. Very, very flexible. Like you can own various heads and various cabinets and bring ones that you want to bring for that particular gig. Or I can play a gig and just use this as a preamp and not bring the cabinets at all. So now my cartage is pretty light at that point. But if it has cabinets at the gig, I can just take this and use their cabinets. I've done that in the past. It's very modular in that case. Downside is cost. You're going to spend more because you're buying a head and you're going to buy a cabinet or more cabinets. Sometimes there's limitations in terms of how many speakers you can use with some of the heads, which I will get to when we talk about impedance and ohms, which we're not there yet, so don't worry. These scare people, but it's really a pretty simple subject. So those are kind of the upsides and downsides of the head and the cabinets. I generally have used the head and cabinets for most of my career. It's just what I prefer. I own a combo. I was going to say I don't own a combo, but like we own one that Susan's kids play through. But I'm really not a huge fan. But like I have tons of friends that use them all the time that love them and they work great for them. It's just personal preference at that point. The preamp and power amp and speakers, or preamp and powered cabs right now, the upside is it's super flexible. Any kind of preamps you want to use, if you want to use different power amps to get more power, or you want to take one that's lighter, like I can take this and just use it as a power amp bypass the internal preamp of this, just use this as a power amp and use one of my other preamps, which is what I do when I use another preamp these days. You can bring a couple cabs, one cab, you can bring tons of cabs. A lot of these power amps are stereo, and you can run up to 8 cabinets sometimes with these things. I've done it, and it's going to be loud. Downside is it costs a lot. You're buying each thing individually, so it's going to jack the price up. The size of all these things taken together, the bulk tends to be much bigger, and there's the weight of all this stuff. And of course, you can use the lighter weight stuff, but it's just more stuff, and your car gets full really, really fast. So these are things to consider. So what the heck is a preamp? What the heck does it do? There's, like I said before, there's a preamp in this, but there's also standalone preamps. So we'll look at my Demeter in my Calzone case, and I actually know Joe Calzone. I played with him. He's a great drummer. He's here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm not in Bridgeport, but pretty close to me. So there's my name drop. Great guy. Anyhow, here's my Demeter preamp, which I love dearly. I think you can see me through here. So, what a preamp does is it takes, you plug into these input jacks here, it takes the low-level signal of your bass guitar, and it turns it into a line-level signal suitable for driving a power amp. That's its entire job. However, it also changes the tone. Most preamps have their own kind of voicing. You can hear, that one sounds different. And there's a video I'll link at the end of this that really demonstrates that quite a bit. And also, they tend to have tone controls on them. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. So you can shape the sound. They have their own voicing. And then, like on the back of a standalone preamp, you'll have some kind of outs, like these main outputs. That's what goes into a power amp. There's also an effect send and return and a DI out on this particular one. Most of them have those as well. Not all of them, but most of them. But essentially, those line outs, that's what's going to go into a power amp. And the job of a power amp, on the other hand, is to turn that line level signal into a speaker level signal, which is going to physically move these speakers. It's pretty impressive. Because of that, they tend to be kind of hefty. Not always. The D-class power amps now, like the ones in this sucker, the ICE modules, really small, really, really lightweight. But a lot of power amps, standalone power amps, tend to be big. Most of them are rack mount, not all of them. They tend to be big and bulky. And let's back up a little bit and talk about preamps and power amps. You can stack preamps. In other words, like that caveman preamp I talked about. I have done, I've used that thing, that little floor mount preamp, and plug it into the front of the Mesa. So now I'm using both preamps. I can use the tone controls of this, use the coloration of that caveman to give it that bigger, fatter sound. The downside of that is that's going to add noise into the signal. I would not do that in the studio. It also, like, the more that you stage different preamps, because there's also, like, Make's a preamp in my bass, and I've got 3 preamps. So each one of these preamps is amplifying the noise, and they're also starting to kind of, like, there's signal loss. There's sometimes you can bypass them altogether, like, oh, dear, that sounds good. What happened? So, they can weigh down the signal. In the case of preamps and power amps, there are solid state and there's tube. One is not better than the other. This right here is a solid state preamp and solid state power amp. The Demeter is a tube preamp. They sound different, but it's not just because of the tube. I've had tube preamps where I bypassed the tube entirely and just gone into the effects return, because the effects return actually contain the rest of the solid state section of the preamp, and it sounds just the same. The tube really doesn't seem to be doing very much. Other amplifiers, the tube seems to be an awful lot. But some of the most popular, well-regarded preamps of all time are solid state. So it's not, better or worse. It's just they can sound different. So don't get all freaked out and say, oh, wow, it's got a tube preamp. That's the best. It may be super awesome. It may not be super awesome. It depends. Two preamp tubes can have their own characteristics, and like in the Mesa WD, it can kind of get really spongy. So however they got that figured out in there, it's good. Not to be a Mesa fanboy, but I just particularly like the way they utilize that tube in the preamp. Other ones, I'm like, I don't think it's doing anything. I think it's just to say tube. Tube power amps, on their hand, and solid state power amps, different animals, very different animals. Solid state tend to be very clean, very fast reacting, very, very accurate. Low end is really, really solid. tube power amps, the low end tends to be a little bit mushier. They tend not to act as fast. I mean, there's not a lag, but just there's a sonic difference. And they can add a very pleasing, blooming coloration to the sound, and they are big and they are heavy. And because of the output transformers and everything else, and they can be expensive to retube. And my bias and preferences showing here. I love the way they sound. I'm never going to own one unless I have unless I get so famous that people are going to carry it around for me. They also behave differently when it comes to how they interact with speakers when we talk about ohms. So we'll get there. But mostly, I'm mostly going to talk about solid state power amps here. So last but not least is the speakers or drivers. The round things inside these boxes we tend to generally call drivers. And sometimes there'll be a tweeter or something else in there. That's another kind of driver. And so their whole job is to take that speaker level signal and move air. Sometimes these things will have an internal crossover, like if they've got a tweeter and a woofer in them. Other times not so much. They will have an impedance. I don't think you're going to be able to see this right here. It says nominal impedance 8 ohms on this particular cabinet. Impedance is almost, but not quite, resistance. It's very highly related, so you can kind of think of it in the same way. It includes capacitance, a couple other factors. It doesn't really matter. What matters is actually matching the output of the power amplifier to the speakers themselves. And before we talk about that, let me talk about cabinet design and speaker size. And I know I'm probably going to get comments about this. Speaker size doesn't matter all by itself. It just doesn't. You look at the Ampeg 810. These are 10s. These amps, I played through them. I played through some of their 410s recently, actually with Joe Calzone. I forget what cabinet they had on the stage for me. And just had this monstrous low end. Not as much mids as I would like, but it's monstrous low end. And there's so many factors that go into the design of a cabinet, into the design of speakers, that you can't say that, bigger is going to produce more bass or bigger is going to be more sluggish. There's way too many factors. So there's a lot of factors. What's more important, things like the sensitivity of the cabinet, like how loud is it going to get, based on like 1 watt or, with all things being equal, some cabinets will just be instantly louder than the cabinet next to them. But the most important thing is the impedance of the cabinets and the impedance of your amplifier. Now, I'm going to talk about solid-state amplifiers because that's what you're going to run into the most. Now, I'll just kind of briefly mention tube because they're a little weird and a little bit different. But ohms and impedance scare the bejesus out of people. It's really not that hard. Most solid-state amplifiers, up until a little while ago, were only stable at 4 ohms or 8 ohms. Well, that's wrong. They were stable down to 4 ohms. In other words, if you try to run a load lower than 4 ohms, then they would tend to overheat. This particular unit has a switch right here, and it can go down to 2 ohms safely. Well, how do I determine what I'm supposed to plug into it? I can plug in any impedance higher than that, completely safely, up to infinity, which means no speakers at all. This amp will run just fine as a preamp. It's fine. However, if I plug anything less than 2 ohms into this, then it's going to start to overheat. Cabinets, these all have these jacks. They're all wired out in parallel. I'm sure there must be one somewhere in the world that's wired in series, like on the output jacks. I've never seen one in 40 years. I've heard tell. And, you can make special cables to do this kind of stuff. So right here, I've got, what you can see is 2 8-ohm cabinets. They're wired in parallel. When I plug, the outputs from this amplifier into both of these cabinets, or just plug an output into one, and then take another speaker cord and plug into the next one, it is now 4 ohms. There is a formula for doing that, which I will not share because I'm not going to go into that part of the video, but you can find it out. Generally, you're not going to wire cabinets to speaker series, so it's going to get less. Now, if I were to, there's another cabinet which you cannot see, which is another 8-ohm cabinet. If I were to daisy chain all 3 of these together, the impedance now would be 2.67 ohms. Some of those old heads I had, like my old Eden, my old SWR, would melt if I plugged all 3 cabinets in there. So I couldn't run a load of 2.67 ohms. If I had 4 of these cabinets together, it would be 2 ohms. Now, There are a lot of amplifiers out there right now, like say, I'll pick on Aguilar. They make some great amplifiers like the Tone Hammer series. They're only stable down to 2.67 ohms, which means I can use 3 8-ohm cabinets, or I can use a 4-ohm cabinet and an 8-ohm cabinet together. And that will bring me down to 2.67 ohms. I can't use 2 4-ohm cabinets because that's going to be 2 ohms. With this sucker, one of the reasons I got it, although I love the way it sounds, and I should hold the right way, is it's stable down to 2 ohms. So I can run these 3 cabinets with it. I can run 4 cabinets with it, 4 8-ohm cabinets. Or, you can't see them, but I've got my two 212s, which are both 4-ohm cabinets. I can run both of those with this head. If I try to plug this in there with all that, well, now I'm below 2 ohms, and I'll fry the head. That's all you got to remember. You can look up the formulas. It's not that difficult. But you don't need to, just because this thing says, 4 ohms, doesn't mean you have to plug only a 4-ohm cabinet into it. It just means you can't plug anything below that. You're never, I don't think I've ever seen a cabinet that's been below 4 ohms. They must exist, but once again, 40 years, never saw one. Every once in a while, you will run to a cabinet that's rated at 5.33 ohms, usually like 310s. And you just have to consider those as 4-ohm cabinets, because no matter how you do the math, if you plug an 8 in with it, it's less than 2.67. You can't do it. So don't do that. Okay, not going to go into that too much more. There is actually an ohms FAQ I wrote on TalkBase, which you can go look at and check out things about impedance and all that stuff a little bit more. So just kind of a little bit of information about that. It's not that hard. Cable types are really, really, really important. When I was a kid, we used instrument cables for everything. Thank God we didn't blow anything up. Instrument cables should be going from your instrument to the front of the head, or front of your preamp, front of the amp. An instrument cable, if you took it apart, it's got one line in the middle of it, coated in rubber or plastic or whatever it is, and then it's got this braided cord around it, the shielding, and you actually, the shielding is actually attached to one part of this as the ground, and then the other part is the signal. That's the instrument level cable. It doesn't handle a huge amount of signal. So you want to use this between your bass and between your in the front of your amplifier. If you use speaker cable in front of your bass and your amplifier, the chances of inducing hum are very, very high because there's no shield. Now, instead, you want to use speaker cable for speakers. So when you plug from the outside of the power amp into the back of the speaker. And these suckers, let's see if I can actually unhook this one. It should have, see, it's got the shrink wrap, so it's made really well. It's actually got 2 lines in the middle of it, no shielding. And because these are, heavier gauge, they handle a lot more signal. The lower the gauge, the better when it comes to speaker cables. So I would suggest don't skimp. Get some 12 gauge or, something like that that's going to handle some decent current. I mean, you're just going to experience signal loss if you don't do that. So, and to get some nice short ones. That said, you have to be careful of what kind of connectors the back of your amplifier and the back of your speaker cabinets have. And my only complaint with the Mesa, but they do it for reasons, is these speaker outputs here are speak-on only. Sometimes you'll find jacks like this, actually on the back of their cabinets, which are combination. It's a speak-on, but you can actually plug a 1/4-inch cable right in there, and both will work. In this case, because of reasons, these are just speak-on outs. Now my bag-end speakers here, well, they don't have speak-on ins. So I have to use a cable that's speak-on one side. Let me see if I can find my cable here. I got all these cables to show you. It's speak-on one side. Here we go. There's our speak-on plug. And it's 1/4-inch on the other side, because this thing does have 1/4-inch cables right here. I just plug that right into. I have to plug this into my head. They actually also make adapters. You can buy speak-on adapters on Amazon, which work really cool. So you can kind of plug your 1/4-inch cable in there. But I actually like these better, a little more durable. Also, every once in a while, you will run into, especially with some old power amps, or if you have to bridge an older power amp, or even some of the newer ones, banana cables. And these suckers right here, you can see actually right now the 2 cables from a speaker cable, the black one, the white one here. So there's no shielding. With banana cables, and sometimes they call them 5-way binding posts, and you can see this right here on this wonderful bag end right there. You got red is positive, black is negative. There's a little tab right here on all banana plugs. That little tab's for negative. So you want to plug that, you want to make sure you plug that into the black, which is negative. If you plug it in the other way and you're daisy chaining cabinets together, you will notice that the cabinets are out of phase. How will you notice that? Because all of a sudden when you plug the next one in, the low end disappears. And you just have to flip it around and plug them into phase. Good thing to know about. When you're connecting your preamp and your power amp, guess what kind of cable you want to use? Instrument cable. So you get a short one, run these things together. And last but not least, sometimes, every once in a while, some of the preamps will have, especially mic preamps, which we're not going to talk about now, which are awesome, will use an XLR out. Actually, the Avalon, the renowned Avalon U5 preamp uses a mic level output, or an XLR output. So you have to have one of those to plug into a power amp. Most power amps will, in fact, accept mic levels. But what you're going to use XLR cables for much more often when you're using a head is for the DI, because almost every single head they make now has a DI out on it, which is awesome because you can send that to the PA and work with the PA, because that's really neat when they can help reinforce your sound. The other stuff you'll see on the back of an amplifier, man, I keep on picking these up and put them down and realize that there were things I wanted to say to demystify some of this stuff. This one has a headphones out, which is great, because remember when I said you can run it infinity ohms? You don't need to run any cabinets. I could do that, or I could also use a headphone out in this and practice when everybody is sleeping, because the bass will shake the house even when you have it on really, really quiet. And I know this for a fact because my first wife, and maybe it was just because it was my first wife, I used to practice in the basement, and on the second floor, she could hear it, and she could, because it just kind of vibrates the house a little bit. So if you want to be polite, that's cool. Let's see what else. Don't use the mute out on this thing very much, but there is a line in and out for the effects loop. Effects out, effects send, which also can act with most of these preamps as a preamp out if you want to run it to another power amplifier. And it'll still run to this one in most cases. You have to check the amp. And that works, but to go to some effects that like line level signals, and then a effects return, which also can act as a power amp in if you don't have something like an auxiliary in. I actually tend to like to use the effects return because it's a little hotter on this amp. Also, you'll find a tuner out on most amplifiers, which is great. And very often, it's a straight shot from the input cord, or the input jack to the tuner out. And so sometimes you can actually run two amps at the same time, because you can just take this tuner out and it's not affected by anything in the amplifier. Once again, depends on the amp. And there are other issues with that, like sometimes the amps themselves are not friendly as far as phase-wise, which means this is going to sound weird. But just something to know, especially if you have a couple identical amps. Let's see, what else should I discuss with you? Watts. Wattage of an amp is an important thing. There's generally a rule of thumb, which isn't entirely true, that you need 4 to 10 times the wattage of your guitar player. It just comes down to the physics of amplifying the octaves that the bass guitar lives in. And it's going to require a lot more wattage and a lot more firepower, sometimes a lot more speaker mass to compete with a guitar player or a loud drummer, in bands which tend to get a little bit loud. So I have always found that, the 4 to 10 times the guitar player rule is pretty effective, especially you don't even try to compare like tube watts, because tube guitar amplifiers are frighteningly loud. This little Mesa is 800 watts. I usually run it, and I run at 800, and I haven't run out of headroom yet with it, but I have plenty of headroom available. 800 watts is not, 8 times as loud as 100. How much louder is it, Ivan? Let's see, I think it's not twice as loud. It's not. Because every time you double wattage, you increase the volume of sound by 3 dB, which is just noticeable. So in order to get twice the volume, you need to have 10 times the wattage. So just something to think about. So it's not even twice as loud as a 100 watt amp. But it's something to consider, when you're buying an amp. My suggestion is to get as many watts as you possibly can, because you never know what you're going to run into. It doesn't mean you have to buy a monstrous amp. Nowadays, the amps have tons of watts in them. and you can plug in other speakers. And I should have mentioned before with the combo amp, one of the issues with the extension speaker, because I did promise to get to that, is you have to look. And the combo amp will say something like extension speaker, 8 ohms minimum. Sometimes they'll say 4 ohms minimum, which is great. But a lot of times the combo amps can only take an 8 ohm speaker because a lot of times they have an 8 ohm speaker within them and the amp is only stable to 4. So you can only use an 8 ohm speaker. Hopefully that at least, has given you some information. I apologize for the video length, but we're really trying to cover a whole lot of subjects within this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I would love to answer them. And I'm going to include a video somewhere down here which talks about, or actually demonstrates, some different preamps that I'm really fond of and how different they sound from one another.